Furthermore, the equation E is equal mc squared.
Houston Discovery.
I'm going to make him an offer, Cameron.
Hello and welcome to another Cheeky Scientist radio show. I'm your host, Isaiah Henkel with Cheeky Scientist. We have a great show lined up today on what smart PhDs do at conferences. If you want to get the full show notes for this radio show, just go to phdsgethired.com and enter your name and email address. You can also go to cheekyscientist.com to learn more about Cheeky Scientist and to sign up there to get updates on how to get hired in industry and how to thrive in your industry career. Today's show is going to start off with a Show Me the Data section. We're going to show you fresh data on going to conferences as a PhD, networking, what you can do to get ahead, what you can do to make connections, to crack into the field of your choice. Then we're going to bring on a very special guest, Jayson Gaignard. Jayson is the host of one of the biggest and most exclusive networking events in the world, Mastermind Talks. Very exclusive. We are talking about $10,000 a ticket. We're really excited to have him on and give us, because he's going to give us some high-level insights on how to network, how to break into a new industry. We also have a live resume review that we will do as well, and we're going to highlight a couple of career paths. Specifically, we're going to talk to Kristen Cederquist about her career path, and we will cover many other topics during this show. So let's jump in with the Show Me the Data section now. The first article we reviewed in the Show Me the Data section is a Forbes article by Michael Simmons. And what it showed is that having an open network, as in where you are the link between different groups of people, it's a significant predictor of career success, right? So in other words, network constraint correlated with poor performance, as in lower compensation in an industry, less likely to get a job, being evaluated poorly by your peers. However, having an open network correlated with greater performance in all of those areas. There's a nice graph that we'll put in the show notes. Just go to phdsgethired.com to view that. Another article by Harvard Business Review. It showed that you are 34 times more persuasive in person. 34 times more persuasive in person. This was backed up by a report in Science Direct, where it viewed the predicted effectiveness in terms of compliance of the other person, right? So when you're networking with somebody, you want to get them to respond to you. You want to get them to reply. You want to get them to set up an informational interview. It was predicted that face-to-face on a scale of 0 to 10, with 10 being the most effective method in terms of their compliance, right? Getting a reply from a networking script or from networking in person. Face-to-face, so networking in person, the predicted value was 5.08. However, the actual value was 7.15. If you want to see the chart on this, again, you can go to our show notes, go to cheekyscientist.com or phdsgethired.com. So again, predicted was 5.08. Actual effectiveness, right, of compliance, of getting that next step in the networking process, whether it was an informational interview, phone screen, site visit, was 7.15. So it went up. Okay, however, email, the predicted success was higher than the predicted success for face-to-face. This should not surprise you, right? If you're a PhD, you think, why go to a networking event in person? It's not going to be successful. I can just send an email. And we tend to think that emails are more effective. That's why the predicted success rate of effectiveness for an email was 5.53. However, face-to-face was 5.08. The actual effectiveness, right? The actual compliance level, getting that reply to the email, getting that reply to your networking script, when it was done online only, was 0.21. Big difference. 5.53 predicted, actual 0.21. Okay, we also reviewed another Forbes article specifically on how to network at conferences, and they gave a lot of tips. What were those tips? Number one, don't attend every session. We talk a lot about this, especially as a PhD. Don't go to every academic talk. Instead, go to the vendor show, right? Meet the people that are working at the companies, exchange a business card, even if you don't have a business card from your university, create a small one, right? Printing them online now, it's like $10 to get a really nice business card where you can put a little mini version of your resume on the back. Number 2, never retreat, right? A whole day of information is exhausting. It's very easy. I do this all the time. I still do. I try not to. I do it less, but I'm kind of an introvert, so I get very de-energized at an event. So what do? I go up to my room and I tend to miss things. I miss connections that I could have made. So don't retreat. Just be there. Just being there in person is a huge predictor of whether or not you're going to make a substantial connection. And networking is kind of an art. You just have to be around. Just show up. Just be there. You'll bump into somebody. That's how things happen. That's how you can make sure that you're more likely to have an effective or productive networking connection at an event. Number 3, follow up. That's really where the networking happens. When you're at the event, that's just connecting. You meet somebody at a poster session, you meet somebody standing by the bar, you connect with them. You build a relationship when you follow up, when you network. And make sure you use social media for that. That's number 4, social media. You want to use that to follow up. And that's the easy part for PhDs because we're kind of introverted, right? Going there and connecting is the hard part. But once you meet somebody face to face, you just heard the data. They're much more likely to comply. They're much more likely to reply. So you have to meet them in person, and then you can do everything else behind the safety of your desk, right? The follow-up process, they met you in person. They know you're functional enough to have a conversation. Now you can follow up and build that relationship. We did look at another Harvard Business Review article called How to Get the Most Out of a Conference by Rebecca Knight. It has some great infographics. It talks about changing your mindset and really introducing yourself. This is something we've discussed a lot, right? Message the other people that are going to be at the conference. Set up some times to meet with them, right? Especially with a large conference where there might be a lot of people in the fields that you want to get into, people from companies at the vendor shows, whatever it might be. If it's a small, networking event, reach out to the host or hostess before, ask them to meet you at the door. They can introduce you to people, pre-introduce yourself. Also, be strategic with your time. You don't have to spend all day at a networking event or all night there. That's what keeps most of us from going. Instead, say, okay, I'm going to meet 3 people, spend 5 minutes talking to each one. That's an effective networking conversation. 5 minutes, let them talk about themselves and what they're interested in for 4 minutes and 45 seconds. And then deliver your elevator pitch, get their business card, and the rest will happen during the follow-up process. These things are highly important. That takes us to the end of this Show Me the Data section. We're going to move on to bring on our first guest now. It's my pleasure to welcome Jayson Gaignard to the show. I'm very excited to talk to Jayson. Jayson has been a great mentor and somebody who's just been fun to watch as he climbs in his space. He delivers and produces, and trust me, it is a production. It's a show, one of the best and most exclusive networking events in the world called Mastermind Talks. His official title is Talent Scout and Curator of Mastermind Talks. He's also the host of the Community Made podcast, so make sure you check out that podcast. Jayson was named one of Forbes' top networkers to watch. He is the founder, again, of one of the world's most exclusive events, specifically for entrepreneurs and business-minded people, Mastermind Talks. His invite-only 3-day live experience has a lower acceptance rate than Harvard University and brings together brilliant minds from various industries. Jayson also hosts a selective and highly curated series of intimate dinners for business leaders, which is the topic of his first book, Mastermind Dinners: How to Build Lifelong Relationships by Connecting Experts, Influencers, and Linchpins. He has been featured in Entrepreneur Magazine, Lifehacker, Business Insider, and Tim Ferriss's #1 New York Times best-selling book, Tools of Titans. Let's jump right in with Jayson Gaignard. So great to have you on, Jayson. Thanks for joining us.
That is too long of a bio. I think in the future I'll be cutting that one a little shorter. And I will say, just in full transparency, I've spoken on very large stages. I've been interviewed on dozens and dozens of podcasts. I've probably never been this nervous because when I came on, you were showing all these graphs and all this kind of stuff. And I'm just not an academic. I don't think like that per se. So I was like, oh my God, I have to pull out the research before I get on the call. So I'm excited. Thank you for having me, man.
Yeah, thanks for being here. I promise I'm not going to ask you for any data or to back up whatever you say. We'll just trust you. Because I do want to say Jayson is an expert on this and he's done a very good job. But before he's been in the event industry for how many years, Jayson? I mean, before even Mastermind Talks,
So our first event we created was 2013, but I've used to spend $40,000-$50,000 a year going to events, joining organizations, masterminds, you name it. So, yeah.
I would show up at like an event to network, and then Jayson would just be there. I didn't even know he'd be like speaking or something. He's ubiquitous if you start going to any of these business kind of events, and there's a lot of them now. So I highly recommend starting to dip your toes into not just the academic events, but more in the entrepreneurship and business world. So you kind of heard my intro, Jayson. I wanted to start by talking to you from your point of view. Now that you've set up so many of these events and you've had so many, I want to say high profile people go, right? Where it's probably harder to get people that are, going to that exclusive event, to get them to network and to get them to connect and to create an environment where it's very open and they want to. So from your perspective, what are some of the things that you look for just to set the stage from the other side of things when you're setting up an event, right? Like when I go to an event, I know I got to do this and I got to reach out and whatever, but as an organizer, what do you see that I'm probably not seeing?
Well, I think the curation is key. One thing that I share a lot is that the stronger the uncommon commonalities amongst people, the stronger the bond. So in the context, like if I were to use entrepreneurship as an example, if I'm based out of Toronto, if I were to walk outside right now and meet 1,000 people at random, 4% of those people would be entrepreneurs. If I wanted to find entrepreneurs with 7-figure businesses, they represent 3% of that 4% statistically, meaning that if I'm at a dinner or at an event with 30 entrepreneurs with 7-figure businesses, that's a really unique opportunity. And when you set up an environment like that where it's heavily kind of curated, you really stack the cards in your favor when it comes to people actually being able to build genuine relationships. Because ultimately, we want to surround ourselves with people who are kind of like us. So that's kind of the first thing, is that level of curation. Also, relationships move at the speed of vulnerability. So if there is a way to instill that vulnerability, and usually it's through the leader or the leadership level. If they set that tone of vulnerability, other people will follow. So sometimes it takes, or it could happen on the lower level, somebody who's just courageous enough to really open up in conversation. And I'm sure we all can look back at a conversation when somebody may have said something that was like, their daughter is struggling with something or their spouse is sick with something, and then it just takes the relationship or the conversation to another level. So trying to instill, again, that curation process, and then also that level of vulnerability, intimacy is huge. And then the one thing that we try to leverage a lot is, wow moments, I guess you could say. So from an experiential component, we try to make almost like once in a lifetime experiences, because you build great bonds over really unique experiences. So those are, from an event producer perspective, an event kind of designer perspective, those are some of like the key pillars, I guess you could say, when it comes to actually wanting people to foster deep and genuine relationships and not forced kind of surface level stuff, which you encounter at a lot of events and dinners and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and thanks. So, I got 3 points here, and I want to kind of dig into those because I think they matter for the other side of things too. Like you talk about curation. What you're really saying is the people that you're around really matter. And it sounds like a no-brainer, right? But let me dig in a little bit more. You have a lot of PhDs here, and we are like, look, I'm going to do things on my own. Like a lot of us got into academia, whatever else, from the mindset. And this is the same for like a lot of business owners and entrepreneurs. I'm going to make it happen myself. So have you really seen like it be a massive difference just getting around like if you want to change careers or whatever else, like what are maybe a couple of examples of just huge breakthroughs that you've seen in yourself or people by changing your...
Well, listen, John Wooden has a great saying that you're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. And there's another saying that who you surround yourself with is who you become. The only reason I've achieved any level of success, again, in this environment, it's interesting. I'm actually a high school dropout. But I've been rather successful in the business world. The only reason being is that I've always surrounded myself with people who are 1 or 2 steps ahead. And what that does unconsciously is, 10,000 years ago, we lived in tribes. So we all have this deep-rooted need to belong and desire to belong because it's kind of tied to our survival. And the one thing is if you start surrounding yourself with people who are playing at a higher level, unconsciously you push yourself to get to the level as quickly as possible so you can feel like you belong. So that's been a great driver for me for many, many years. The only caveat to that, which I'll throw out there, is that if you only surround yourself with people who are 1 or 2 steps ahead, you're always measuring up. therefore you will feel like crap. So what you need to do is ideally, I have this like law of 33% model or plus equal minus model, which is I try to spend a third of my time with people who are playing at a level or two above me, and not necessarily just in the context of business, any area that I want to strive, I guess, quote unquote, to have success in. So I have people that I have in my peer group who are just, they may not be big names in business, but they have an incredible relationship with their spouse, or they're incredible parents, or they're in great physical fitness. So I try to spend a third of my time with people who are one or two steps ahead in those areas. I try to spend a third of my time with people who are at my kind of peer group, because we all have a deep desire to feel understood and seen and all that kind of stuff. And then I try to spend a third of my time on some level. There's a saying by Kevin Spacey that when you achieve a certain level of success, it's your responsibility to send the elevator back down. So I try to spend a third of my time kind of mentoring people and, trying to pull people up, I guess you could say, in some regards. And that's been a nice balance for me. But yeah, I mean, similar, I guess, to obviously, the industry that you all kind of serve in the entrepreneurial world is very similar. Like, everybody thinks they need to do it alone. And anybody who's been successful on any stretch, had a lot of support, and me included. And there's a lot of actually kind of great studies that kind of reconfirm. There's the professional benefits of investing in relationships. There's also the mental health benefits and there's a bunch of studies. There was a fantastic study done by Robert Waldinger. It's the longest study in adult development history. I can't believe I remember this, but for this call, I do. It's the longest study in adult development history. It's been going on for 75 years. It's a Harvard study. And basically, he did a TED Talk on the topic, and their discovery, I think they followed 734 men, and I think a handful are still going on in the study. But basically, they found out the biggest predictor of longevity is not your diet, is not your physical activity, is actually your social relationships. I truly believe social isolation is an epidemic in today's society, and it's showing up in so many areas. There's a fantastic book called Tribe by Sebastian Junger, who he was a former war reporter for 20 years, and he created this hypothesis that he believed that the rise of PTSD wasn't necessarily because of, PTSD is tied to trauma on the battlefield, but statistically there's far less people that see any kind of bloodshed on the battlefield than, in Vietnam and past wars and those kind of things. But the rise of PTSD has gone through the roof. And one of his beliefs is that there's this tight brotherhood or sisterhood when they're in the military, and when they leave, there's that shock, that trauma of like not having that anymore, because in today's society we're just so disconnected. So there's so many different kind of cues there. So there's professional benefits for sure. We could talk about that. Like I've had great success. A lot of people have great success investing in relationships, and they're crucial to your professional success. But there's also the personal side too. Yeah, there's a lot there. There's actually one more statistic. I'm throwing them out there now because, again, I'm going to forget them for your group, and it really matters. Which is, and this to me was a bit of a shocker. There's a gentleman named Keith Ferrazzi who wrote a book called Never Eat Alone. Very popular book. He wrote a second book called Who's Got Your Back? And he didn't actually publish the results of this study in the book, but in conversation, and he confirmed it, when they were doing the research for that book, Who's Got Your Back, they asked, it was about 1,000 people at random, one question only, who has your back? Surprisingly, 55% of those people felt like nobody had their back. Even more surprisingly, 60% of those people were married. Wow. So to me, again, I think it's a huge problem we see in today's society. And, how you build relationships on that kind of intimate level for like your own personal benefit for like mental health and all that kind of stuff is very much, transposes to how you build them professionally. But I definitely want to show that there's much more to these personal relationships than just, advancing your career.
No, and I think that's great. And you just gave the best takeaway for those of you listening, right? We talk about networking and building professional relationships. It's really easy to think that that's just for that end goal of getting a job, but these relationships can stay with you your whole entire life, and they should, because it's healthy for all the reasons that Jayson just said, and many more. Who's got your back? I like that. Actually, the number one thing that we hear from all of you listening and new associates who come in is, it was great to see that I wasn't alone. Right? I thought I was alone, this kind of stuff. And we all feel that. And then you get around the right people, the tribe, like you said, Jayson, go ahead. Yeah, exactly.
One last thing I'm going to throw out there is another one that's still top of mind. I'm excited. I'm telling you, nobody ever like jazzes about these stats. So there's a feature done by Copyblogger, which is like a blog platform, on Aweber, which is a email marketing platform. And basically Aweber discovered, this is back in 2015, so you guys can find the article, but they discovered that they had one email subject title line that worked across industries and just crushed it. It worked for mail enhancement, it worked for selling cars, it worked for personal development, it worked for potty training. And that subject line was, "You are not alone."
Yeah.
So again, that's it. That's all I'm going to say. All right.
No, you're seeing that. I don't know. I think maybe you shared that would be the first time. It's just amazing. And so
yeah, it's Copyblogger. Yeah.
Deep, like tribal in the past. I did want to talk to you about the vulnerability thing, because I think that's something, especially here, we a lot of us struggle with as PhDs. We're a little bit more introverted, but also with the professional side of things, I'd say academia is a little bit more behind the times, I want to say, in terms of sharing vulnerability, where like entrepreneurs, it's almost like it's a topic that's discussed frequently, vulnerability, et cetera. So my question is, what's the line? Like, how do you go from, okay, talking and being vulnerable, like disarming the person, but like, you're not going to get on the phone with like a recruiter and say, "Hey, how are your kids doing?" if you've never met or whatever. But you want to get to that point eventually. So how do you start if you've never met somebody? Like, how have you seen people start at your events, or how do you start?
Yeah, so there's definitely, and it's funny you bring this up, because there's a lot of people disregard the importance of small talk. I did for years. I'm like, small talk is useless. I want to get right to the point. Let's get right to the meat of things. And that's always been my philosophy for the longest time, until I realized that it actually does serve a purpose. I think it was in 2016. There was an article in the New York Times called "The End of Small Talk," I think by Tim Boomer. And basically he had this kind of philosophy that small talk was not necessary. And he gave like 2 examples of these girls that were like in a taxi cab and had these super vulnerable conversations with these taxi cab drivers. And the premise was that like, it's the end of small talk. Now let's focus on big talk. And then the month after, there was a TED Talk by a woman named, I think, Catalina Silverman or something like that. Exact same philosophy, like skipping the small talk. Like, I want to know like what keeps you up at night, or like, you know, like what's your biggest fear? Like just walking up to a person on the street and ask like, "What's your biggest fear?" And like, they were amazed at like all the response that they got, because people opened up and they are vulnerable. But the one thing that was funny about all these examples was that they never saw these people again. So you can be vulnerable with people on a first-time basis, as long as you don't see those relationships, or you don't see those people again. Because oftentimes you unravel yourself so much that you can't, like, the next time you see them, it's awkward. It's almost like, I have not ever had any kind of one-night stand or anything like that. But like, if you think about it, you meet somebody and you become, you know, your full vulnerable self. And I've heard stories about like the next morning it being awkward if you see that person. And then usually like long-term relationships don't stem out of one-night stands. So there's stages of intimacy. And I've actually done a lot of research trying to pull out, well, what are those stages? And a lot of the, I guess the research I found were more around like very intimate relationships, like, you know, just very intimate, like couple or partner relationships, not a lot on the kind of social sphere. So what I decided to do, I basically got a bunch of different research and like pulled together this model, which to me really, really works, and has been really kind of tried, tested, and true. And I've kind of tried to poke holes in it and got other people to poke holes. And basically, well, the way I look at it is that almost like relationship or intimacy is almost like a funnel. And if you look at the top of the funnel, that's how people kind of come on your radar. So like going to events, or like maybe you were introduced, or those kind of things. So first there's this, like the first top of the funnel is this like level of awareness. So you're aware of the other person's existence. They may be aware of you or not, but there's an awareness there. Then after that, you move into contact. And then when you're in contact, that's when you have, you know, that very surface level, you know, conversation and very much small talk and those kind of things. And then you move into an assessment phase. And this is based on Amy Cuddy's work. She's a professor at Harvard, who basically, she said that, like, you know, every time you meet somebody, you go through an assessment phase of, can I trust this person? And like, are they competent ultimately? Because if you can't trust somebody, you know, they're a liability to you ultimately, right? I mean, if you look back to like the whole living in tribes, you want to surround yourself with people who are assets and not liabilities, right? And that's unconsciously what's going through everybody's mind is like, is this person, can I trust them? And are they going to be, beneficial to me? So basically you go awareness, contact, and then the assessment. And that assessment phase, like that's where you decide like, oh, maybe this will just be like an acquaintance or what have you. Or if you want to go deeper, then after that, you move into intimacy. And intimacy is when you start to get kind of vulnerable and share like, what keeps you up at night and those kind of things. Intimacy, like you break down the word intimacy, it's like into me see. It's basically kind of opening up and let them see, what the outer world doesn't see, so to speak. And that's where like, again, like the real magic happens when it comes to relationships. And then the final tier, which is usually what they found in studies is like your best friends, is basically people who support your social identity status, I guess, on in some degree. So, sometimes if you went to school with somebody and you chose academia and they chose like maybe the corporate world or they chose entrepreneurship, there's a chance you may not be able to like relate, again, because you don't share that strong uncommon commonality. But ultimately, if you do support each other's kind of social status in the world or in society, you can continue to be kind of friends or best friends. So usually somebody's best friend statistically or historically supports your social identity on some level. So that's the way I look at these things because, again, and without having that visual, people can discredit small talk because, again, they're like, it's a waste of time, what have you. But when you understand it in phases, to me, you actually start to see the value of it. So no, you can't, in my belief, you can't meet somebody and be like, I don't know what kind of vulnerable question you can ask them, but basically you don't lean in with vulnerability because the next time you see them, you can't, once you unravel yourself, you can't unravel yourself basically. So sometimes you'll do more harm than good if you try to be vulnerable too quickly.
I love that. And I just want to say those first three steps that Jayson just talked about, awareness, contact, assessment, those are the three main stages for your job search. Same with the job search funnel we talk about. You're going to these events, you're meeting people, you're getting introductions. That's that first level assessment. Then you have contact, right? You have a phone screen or recruiter, whatever. And then that final thing is they're assessing you. Can I be with this person 8 hours a day for the next 20 years or whatever? 100%. So great stuff. We have a question. I want to bring that on in a second, but I want to ask you one more. I want to make sure we get to this because I heard you tell the story about you going to networking events. And it was funny. And you're like, I'm basically horrible at this or was horrible. I'd go to the event. You're more introverted and like it's a struggle for you to make contact. And then once you do, you're fine because then you do all the follow up and building the relationship afterwards. And so we've been trying to draw this distinction between connecting at events and then actual networking, following up and building the relationship. Do you have any tips there on what you've learned over the years or what you've seen other people do at kind of like an expert level at your events?
Yeah. So basically how they make the most out of that kind of interaction post-event?
Yeah. How to connect and then what do you do afterwards? What does the follow-up look like?
Well, I'm just pulling it up now because so the funny thing is I just did a workshop on this and I've had people come to me and they're like, how do you do this? Or why do you like basically trying to dissect how I do things. And to me, it's become just natural, right? Just become like, this is the way I do things and that's it. So that actually for me to pull out and break things down into a system has been really difficult. So I just did a workshop. So I'm going to pull it up right now as far as, because there are 4 things that I use that work really, really well. But the one thing I will say is like, I definitely identify to being an introvert. And that's hard for people to believe again, because Forbes called me the top 3, I guess. I didn't even know it was 3rd. But like, one of the top networkers to watch and all that kind of stuff. And what I've come to kind of realize, like, there's truth in introversion and extroversion and all that kind of stuff. But to me, what I try to put more emphasis on is, are you comfortable or uncomfortable in social situations? Because you can put an introvert amongst friends and they'll be like, they'll be lit up, they'll be engaged in conversation, but then you put them in a room where they don't know anybody and it proves to be rather difficult. So when I have that kind of point of view, I'm like, well, if I'm going into an event, how can I already know what I'm going to expect on some level as far as like, I need to prepare. I have an opportunity to prepare. So, I know if I'm going to walk into a room of people, I'm going to have to, introduce myself. So how do I introduce myself? That's something I can prepare and practice in person because when you do it on the fly, it's always, at least for me, a disaster, right? I start like mumbling on my words. I probably will go on a 2 or 3 minute tangent if I'm nervous and all this kind of stuff. So practicing your introduction. And there's a mutual friend of ours, Clay Hebert, who has, I think, he has this philosophy called the perfect intro. And I think if you go to theperfectintro.com, you'll find the website. But he breaks down how to do it. And like the real basic framework that he uses, which I think is beautiful, it's because it's very plug and play, is or it could be I or we. But at its core, it's I help customer, whatever customer that is, achieve result, like what that looks like. So you just replace those things. So I help customer, whatever the customer is, achieve results. So for me, it's I connect fascinating entrepreneurs. Right. And the whole purpose of that introduction, and he can go into it again if you look at his work, but it's supposed to like create interest and intrigue so that you can actually kickstart conversation, as opposed to sometimes you introduce yourself and you said everything, and then the person's like, okay, well, now where are we going to go in conversation? There's nowhere to go. So you're going to introduce yourself. You're going to participate in some kind of small talk, and you also know you're going to share your story on some level, like some portion. If your introduction goes well, they're going to say, well, how'd you get into that, that field or what have you? So preparing these things in advance. In my own personal story, I have like a 30-second version, a 60-second version, a 3-minute version, so I can be very flexible based on the context. But I think that helps me tremendously during the event. And there's another kind of philosophy. Another friend of ours, Todd Herman's coming out with a book called The Alter Ego. And I think and I think it's a beautiful approach. Basically, he is a peak performance coach for like Olympic athletes and that kind of stuff. And one thing that he kind of realized, and this got solidified when he was in conversation with, I think it was Bo Jackson. Yeah. And the whole premise was that Bo Jackson outside the field is like a sweetheart of a guy, all that kind of stuff. But when he gets on the field, he's like a monster. And Bo explained it. He's like, for some reason, like once I hit my right heel on the green of the field, I switch into this like alter ego. So Todd is elaborating in a book on this whole philosophy that a lot of top performers have these alter egos. So when I go to an event, like I may be like shy and timid and introvert and all that kind of stuff, but the minute my cue is the minute I walk through the door and I put my foot down, my right heel down, I switch and I perk up. I have, my arms are open. I'm excited. And I just need to maintain that for like 30 seconds, 60 seconds. And then I'm already kind of in the zone, so to speak. So that alter ego thing has helped me tremendously kind of overcome that introversion.
That's so funny you say that. I think it was Mastermind Talks 2014. I sat next to Todd. The first thing he told me was about this alter ego. He told me the Bo Jackson story. And I was like, tell me more. And he's like, and then the first person got on stage, I think it was you, and you interrupted him telling me that. But no, it was good. Yeah, I can't believe he's finally doing the book. Wow, that's great. So one question. Thank you for staying on. I want to bring on Patricia real quick. Patricia, if you want to ask your question before we let Jayson go.
Hi, Jayson. Can you hear me?
I can hear you beautifully.
Hey, I first heard of you at Mike Dillard's podcast. Great background, dude. Really good. So I want to ask something about what you just said of bringing your alter ego. So becoming maybe someone that you're not always like that. How aggressive should you be when you are networking? How can you take the best out of the situation without being too aggressive? Or should you be so aggressive in your network?
No, that's a great question. You only have one opportunity at a first impression. And I very much one thing I guess I have in my favor is I very much play like the long game. And I'll give you an example of this and hopefully it's helpful. I spoke at an event that was in Vegas two years ago. There's a speaker there named Gary Vaynerchuk. And he's well known in the business community, and he was on stage and he was speaking, and two people rushed the stage to go take a selfie with him. And the funny thing is I was supposed to talk about relationships on the final day, and I brought it up in conversation or in my talk. I'm like, if you rush on stage and take a selfie with somebody, you pretty much guarantee that you're not going to build a relationship with them because on some level you're putting them on a pedestal. And when you put somebody on a pedestal, it means unconsciously you're not on the same level. And again, ultimately, we want to surround ourselves with people who are assets and not liabilities. But the funny thing is that at that same event, that first night, I was sitting at the back of the room, and I didn't know Gary, but him and I have crossed paths on kind of numerous occasions. And I was sitting at a table, and I was with a fellow speaker who actually Isaiah knows, and she was with me, and Gary walked into the room, and she's like, oh, I want to go take a photo with Gary. And listen, I'm human too. I'm like, part of me is like, yeah, I want to go take a photo too. But I'm like, no, I got to play the long game, sit back, just let it happen. And I was sitting there. She ran to go take a photo. And then he was walking around this VIP table, and somebody was speaking on stage, and then he was kind of right near me. And then after maybe 30 seconds, he turned around, extended his hand and said, hey, I'm Gary. And I shook his hand, and I was like,
Wow.
I know exactly who you are in the back of my head. I was trying to play dumb. But ultimately, like, that's how you build deep and genuine relationships. You're not going to build a relationship running up to somebody and taking a selfie or really pushing conversation and those kind of things. So there's certain people who are quote unquote big names that I've kind of become friends with over time. But I saw them 3-4 times in a social setting, and I didn't say a word. We just saw each other's face. So there's that kind of reference point, but I never really pushed or forced those relationships. I know some people are more aggressive, and they have success on some level. But again, I'm very much like long term, and I do know as a fact you can't make a second first impression. So I'm very, very careful when it comes to that first impression. So yeah, it's weird. It's hard to put a line, I guess you could say, on how aggressive to be. It's really whatever feels like most comfortable and natural to you. If you're an introvert, most likely you'll probably be a little more aggressive than you think. And if you're an extrovert, you probably should be a little less aggressive than you probably think or probably already are. So yeah, you'll have to figure out kind of what's natural, but always keeping that end goal, or not the end goal, but that long-term kind of viewpoint at relationships, I think is absolutely crucial.
Perfect. No, that's great. Thank you both. I want to do these couple of lightning round questions with you real quick, Jayson, but I do want to say, funny that you say that, because the first mastermind talks I went to, I was like really excited to meet James Altucher, and I was like an excited dog, I'm like talking to him, like, James is like very like, okay, get away from me, basically. And then I came to like the second or third one, and I randomly sat next to him, and I was just like, whatever. And he totally noticed. He's like, hey, why are you so relaxed this time? Like, what life experience did you have that made you relaxed? So it was like a vulnerable question anyway. So that's awesome. Maybe you get a second chance. I don't know. Couple of quick questions here, and we'll let Jayson go. So Jayson, what is the current book or books you're reading right now?
Oh, God. You know what? In full transparency, I'm not reading any books.
How about podcasts? Podcasts you listen to regularly?
I'm not reading. So there's this. Okay. Sorry, I just ruined your question.
No, it's okay.
No, well, so there's a saying that reading is inhaling and writing is exhaling. I reached a point a couple months back where I was just like tapped out. I noticed this wave with me where I'm like, I can't consume another bit of information. I need to get it out. So I like season 2 of my podcast was actually all about relationships, was that kind of outlet. So I haven't got back. I have to get like almost inspired, and I'll go on like this book rampage or this learning kind of rampage for a short period of time. So I can't think. I mean, one of my favorite books of all time, and I've reread it a bunch of times, is Tribe by Sebastian Junger. I think it's a beautiful book. And
I'm just going to, if you haven't checked out Jayson's podcast, Community Made, I just put the link in there. You got to check it out. It's really, really good. Okay, let me try to recover just like with like 3 quick questions.
No worries.
One of the worst pieces of advice you've ever received?
In the context of relationships or in life? Honestly, I mean, probably the whole notion of fake it till you make it, and the alter ego thing kind of plays on it on some level, which is why I'm always, very hesitant to share it. But that's very kind of, I think there's being open and transparent as far as like where you are in your journey, like especially when you're reaching up or you're talking to somebody who's at a, further along. I think people underestimate how endearing that is, and how we all have a desire to kind of send the elevator back down. And oftentimes we try too hard to like posture and like position ourselves as like we know everything when we don't, and all those kind of things. So I think like that's one thing I see a lot. I mean, just in general, again, I was kind of taught that to like really posture and, I'm more successful than I am and those kind of things. But I realized that, people on some level, they can see right through it oftentimes. And I can see right through it now that, that people do it to me sometimes. But there's there's this beauty of just being like vulnerable, honest, transparent. And there's that endearing quality that actually makes people want to support you more, or be, connect the dots for you, or give you business opportunities or career opportunities and those kind of things. So I think that's probably one of the biggest things that stands out.
That's the perfect word too, endearing. And I think that's great advice. So we're going to leave it there. Jayson, thank you for your time. Really appreciate you staying on, man. This is great.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for watching another great Cheeky Scientist radio show. We hope you learned a lot from our guests. We hope you enjoyed all of the different sections. If you want to get these episodes delivered right to your inbox, go to phdsgethired.com, enter your name and email address. If you are a PhD interested in getting a job in industry, again, make sure you go to phdsgethired.com. If you want to learn more about Cheeky Scientist, go to cheekyscientist.com. You can sign up there to get our resume guidebook, our resume template, and lots of tools and lots of materials that'll help you get hired in industry. Until next time, remember your value as a PhD and start thinking and acting like a successful industry professional.